We are live, sir.
You're live? Okay.
Yes, we're live.
Welcome to the last of the distinguished lectures under the Foundation Month series. We have Vint Cerf with us to deliver his distinguished lecture. Vinton Cerf, Vinton G. Cerf is the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google currently. He got his bachelor's from Stanford University and a PhD from UCLA. At UCLA, he started working on key internet technologies such as TCP/IP, and later at DARPA. He did this work with Bob Kahn. Together, they were awarded the Turing Award in 2004, and together they are called the two fathers of the internet. He was also awarded, made a fellow of the foreign fellow of the Royal Society in 2016. He has worked at IBM, Stanford as an assistant professor, in DARPA, in MCI, CNRI, and now Google. He has achieved everything that one can think of. But what truly astonishes me is his enthusiasm to volunteer for all sorts of things that I have been fortunate to see upfront. He has served many years on the ICON board. He has been ACM president and been playing the role in ACM Awards Committee for many years. He has worked with the Gallaudet University, and he's on the governing council of IIIT Hyderabad. It was in 2007 when he visited India. Google wrote to some of us saying, if you want to meet this person, Vint Cerf, please come to a breakfast meeting. And we had a breakfast meeting with him in one of the hotels here, and very delightful meeting in which he tried to get intricacies of the cricket game from us. And I don't know if he managed to impart any knowledge to him, but the meeting was very good. And from 2010 onwards, when I was playing a lead role in ACM India, and he was already in the ACM India Council, ACM Council, Global Council, and later the ACM President from 2012, we got to interact quite a bit. In 2011, I think it is in 2011, he visited IIIT Hyderabad. He gave a talk here, and when he heard about our structure of not having department but being organized around problem areas, he was very fascinated by it. He asked many questions, and quite independently, I heard him talk about these things to other people in the ACM circles. And so one day I had the courage to ask him, would you be, if you're so enamored of this, would you help us by being on the governing council of IIIT Hyderabad? He agreed with the caveat that he cannot travel to every meeting. So he's been on our governing council and helping us in many ways. What is really truly remarkable is the amount of volunteering energy that he has. He works on several committees of ACM, ICON, the US government, and many other bodies, I'm sure. We are in the ACM Technology Policy Committee to counsel together for the last 6 months or so. And the other fact that strikes me is how readily he gives his time to interact with youngsters or others, computer scientists and others. I've seen it upfront during his visits in India when we had the ACM India meetings, and I've seen it a couple of times in the Heidelberg Laureate Forum. He's always eager to spend time with the young laureates and enthusing them. Vint is a lover of fine wine, a connoisseur of Shakespeare, classical music, travel, gourmet cooking, sci-fi, etc. And as you can see, he has dressed himself well in a nice Indian safari suit. Welcome, Vint. Please, we are all eagerly waiting for your words. Those who are listening, if you have any questions for Vint, please type it into the chat box. Somebody will monitor it, and we will bring up as many questions as we can at the end of his talk. Over to you, Vint.
Thank you so much, PJN, and hello, everyone. I must tell you that the suit that I'm wearing was acquired in a 24-hour period when I was in Rajasthan New Year's Eve party. My host opened the door, was wearing an outfit like this. And when I saw it, my immediate words were not even hello and how are you and Happy New Year. It was, I want one of those jackets. So happily, a seamster, what do you call it? I've just drawn a blank on the right word. Anyway, the wife of my host had someone come out to actually design and make this in 24 hours. So I'm really proud to wear this. But let me tell you that not all cultures recognize this as a formal dress. I decided when I was in Japan accepting an honorary degree from Keio University that instead of wearing my normal three-piece suit, that I would upgrade to a formal Indian tunic, which I did, and hoping that it would convey to my audience my respect for them, as I hope the same thing is true of my respect for you. But at the end of my lecture, someone came over and said, thank you, that was a very interesting lecture, but why are you wearing a Japanese high school student's uniform? And so this was kind of a cultural collision for me. But I know you recognize this and you know that it means that I have great respect for you and the school. So thank you again, PJN, for allowing me to spend some time. I think I want to focus on several things this morning. The first one is to speak to the effects of the pandemic that we're all going through, because it has relevance to our role in software and networking. The second, I want to talk about the impact or the implications of that software element. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about ethics and the responsibility that we who make and use software or provide software services have in terms of responsibility. So let me start with the pandemic. It's almost as if it has shown a very, very bright spotlight on the fragments and fissures in our social and economic systems. That's certainly true here in the United States, and I think it's probably true in India as well. We realize in these conditions how dependent we are on infrastructure. And when I think of infrastructure, of course, I think very broadly. I think of the institutions of government. I think of the institutions of business. I think of schools like the IIIT. I think of technology infrastructure, whether it's roads or the water system or sanitation systems or healthcare systems, the internet, telecommunication, power generation and distribution. These are all infrastructure. And one of the properties of infrastructure is that we don't notice it and we pay very little attention to it and we rely on it without thinking about it until it doesn't work. And when it stops working, suddenly we are deeply conscious of how dependent we have been upon it. So when the power goes out, lots of things stop working, including your computer and your internet and radio and television and all the other modern appliances that we rely on. And that's just one particular infrastructure. Think of all the others. So a lot of what I'm going to say relates to infrastructure, our dependence on it, and our need to make it resilient and robust. We have to be able to recover from loss of infrastructure, and we have to be able to make it as resilient as possible so that the probability of losing it is low. Now, the internet itself is an infrastructure that we are increasingly reliant on. And there is a flip side to our reliance on it. As powerful as that is, when we lose it, of course, then there may not be much in the way of backup. The other side of that coin is that there are a lot of people who don't have access to the infrastructure at all. So they're in a permanent state of denial. And that means that they do not have the ability to leverage the use of that infrastructure for all the myriad purposes to which we put the internet and computers and all the other tools that go along with it. So my big concern is that we are seeing in the course of the pandemic how dependent we have become on the internet where it is available, and how unacceptable it is that it is not available everywhere to serve the needs of people in a situation like the one we're in, where we have to work from home, where we have to socially distance, where we have to wear masks, and where there is great inequity in the impact of the pandemic, because for some people, jobs cannot be done remotely. They have to be done face-to-face. They have to be done in proximity. And we can see that the portions of our infrastructure that depend on that proximity can easily be broken. Think about supply chains in general. If you look at the supply chains for medical equipment, masks and other apparatus, protective equipment, to say nothing of pharmaceuticals, you realize that during the pandemic, that infrastructure, that supply chain has been broken in many places. We've seen some very peculiar things happen where farmers in the United States have been unable to deliver their product to restaurants because the restaurants aren't ordering anything because they're not open, because people can't come to the restaurants safely to have a meal together. So the farmers are throwing things away as a result. And of course, the economy is affected dramatically in consequence of that. So, the supply chain picture really needs to be re-understood and rethought. We need to be able to figure out how to use the internet, for example, to reestablish supply chains when they become broken. Another thing that I believe is equally important in the pandemic context is the access to information that the internet gives us. And that access, of course, is vital if you're trying to figure out how to respond to the pandemic. What things should you do? What should you not do? Where should you go if you need help? That dependence on information and access to it and discovery of it also exposes yet another big problem, because not all the information on the internet is accurate and correct. To make matters worse, in some cases, it's deliberately incorrect. That's called disinformation. And other people propagate what I'll call misinformation simply out of ignorance. They don't know that what they are repeating or sharing is in fact incorrect. And so we see the same valuable information also being propagated along with misinformation and disinformation. And of course, it's our job as users to try to figure out, which is which. That's what we use critical thinking and wetware for. Which, by the way, is the reason education is so important, which brings me to the last point I want to make on this infrastructure topic, which is the role of the internet and education. And you are experiencing this directly at IIIT because you've had to operate in some cases in a remote way where students don't attend classes in person. They have to attend them through the net if they have access to the net and if the professors are in a position to do their lectures online. But this raises yet another point, because the in-class experience and the remote experience, as the one we're using now, are not the same thing. There are more opportunities for side conversations and for gathering informally, for working together in front of a whiteboard, having a big argument to figure out how to solve a problem. Those experiences don't necessarily translate well into the online world. So this is in some ways a weaker substitute for being in class in a physically present way. The other side of that coin, however, is that there are often opportunities to use the power of networking and the power of software to enhance the experience of education. A trivial example of this is that if the lectures are recorded, you can play them over and over again. It's very hard for the professor to repeat himself or herself over and over again, but it's no problem if you replay a lecture. And if you want to become a little more elaborate, think about what were called MOOCs, the massive open source, what's it? Massive open, I forget what the other one is, classes. Sorry. Do you remember what is the acronym?
Online open.
Online open, thank you. Okay, so anyway, the MOOCs had the interesting property that if you prepared one, you had both the challenge and the opportunity to think a little bit about the audience and how you could figure out whether you were reaching them. Now, in a class, you can sort of tell whether the students are understanding what you're saying. But if you are, if you're in a remote environment or if your lecture is pre-recorded, one of the tricks that you can play, which requires a lot of work, is not only to prepare a lecture and give it, but to break it into pieces and have some questions that the student can answer with, multiple choice, for instance, in between each segment. And if you discover that the student is not understanding the material based on the answers they're picking, then you can also pre-record remedial material to help the student understand the part that didn't sink in. The reason that makes for a lot of extra work, of course, is you have to think about how can my students misunderstand my crystal clear lectures? And you have to admit to yourself that maybe your lectures are not as perfect as you thought they were. So there's a lot of extra effort required to prepare a really good quality MOOC. One of my colleagues, one of your colleagues in ACM is David Patterson, another Turing Award winner, a former president of ACM, who was at Berkeley and prepared a number of MOOCs and told me personally how hard it was to do that in this feedback fashion. So let me switch gears now, assuming PJN, do I still have some time to go on? Okay, he's nodding in case you didn't see that. So I want to talk a little bit about software because everything I have been talking about has a software component to it. And that's what people like you and me are involved in, whether it's in the production of the software, the operation of the software, the distribution and use of the software, the design, and so on. We make stuff out of software. And when you think about the versatility of a computer, there's almost nothing we can't make. I mean, we're limited only by our capacity to write software and by our imaginations. So it's an endless frontier. It's an absolutely wonderful technology area because of its richness and because its endless possibilities. So, the end product is applications that people can use, harnessing the power of a computer to do something for you, to do something faster or on a larger scale than you could do on your own. I mean, think about searching the World Wide Web manually. I mean, forget it. I mean, there are billions of websites. There's no way you would ever get through to find the thing that you're interested in. And yet we harness computers to do that for us. Similarly, language translation, I speak, 1.5 languages or so. You probably speak many more than that. But you still don't speak all the languages of the world. And yet computers are starting to learn through machine learning how to understand, at least to the extent of translation, literally hundreds of languages. At least at Google, we have over 100 of languages that we can correctly translate from one language into another, or to recognize the speech for. So, those applications are rich in their possibilities. But the application can't run by itself. It has to run in some matrix, and we call that an operating system. And so this is, if we were to imagine that this software world is layered, we go from the application down into the operating system layer, which manages the resources of the computing system and applies those resources to the applications that need them. It turns out that that's a fairly elaborate design process. Implementing an operating system that runs successfully is hard, even if we get it right. And most of the time we make mistakes. And of course that leads to bugs, and bugs lead to malware. They lead to denial of service attacks. They lead to all kinds of bad behaviors in online environments, and even offline. Historically, malware used to be propagated with diskettes. People would put malware on the diskettes and then hand the diskettes out saying, here's a great game, you might want to play it. People would load up the diskette and they would get infected with malware. So we have a real challenge as we create software, especially down in this core level of the operating system, to resist the kinds of attacks against mistakes we've made, the bugs that are in the software. Which leads me to observe another thing, and that's a side effect of the pandemic has been remote medicine. These doctors were saying, don't come into my office. My staff doesn't have protective equipment. You can call me on the phone, or I'd be happy to have a video chat. And of course, my reaction to this is that's a terrible way to practice medicine. Yes, I can see you and talk to you, but you didn't take my pulse rate and my temperature and all the other states of my health, because we're not in the same room together, which has led me to believe that during this pandemic period, there is huge incentive to build an internet of medical things. You know, you've all heard about the Internet of Things. Well, let's focus on medical sensor systems in particular, which you could potentially have at home, and you could provide information to a doctor, more information about your current physical state. And I think over time, we will be able to create more and more elaborate instruments at a cost that's reasonable, so that you could have those things available and a remote consult would be feasible. Think about the consequences of that line of reasoning. If the internet can be made to spread more fully so that it reaches rural parts of the country better than it does now, or even in urban parts of the country where internet service may still be inadequate, imagine that we have a more fully networked environment. Then those instruments can be used to provide remote access to doctors who might not even be local. And so the consequence of remote medicine, which has been a dream for decades now, might actually be a side effect of developments to respond to the pandemic. So once again, a very important concept. Now, I will say that as you start thinking about programmable devices that fall into the Internet of Things category, you should be very nervous. At least I certainly am. And the reason I'm nervous is not because of artificial intelligence or machine learning or the robots are going to take over. It's because every one of those devices has software in it which may not be correct. It may be buggy. And I'm relying on that device to do what it's supposed to do, whatever that happens to be. And if it doesn't do the right thing, there's potential harm. Now, the easy cases are the one where it's a toaster and you can remotely control how burned you want your toast, and the program doesn't do it right and your toast always comes out burned. That's not a disaster except at breakfast, but it's certainly not life-threatening. On the other hand, if it's a medical device of some kind that has software associated with it, or it's an analytic system that's supposed to be helping do a diagnosis, mistakes in the software, and that includes in machine learning neural networks, could have life-threatening consequences. And of course, there's everything in between. So we should be very worried about the software that goes into Internet of Things types of devices, medical included. And the reason it's so concerning is that a lot of these devices are inexpensive. And people just grab software from open source libraries, toss it into the device and say, done, and they sell the device. And then they forget about it. Of course, if there are bugs, they don't bother fixing them. So we have buggy software going in and no attempt to maintain the software and repair mistakes. That's something which I believe needs to change. I think that people who sell programmable devices need to take responsibility for maintaining them for the reasonable lifetime of that device. And that's a big business change, potentially. And it's not any different, by the way, than mobile phones and laptops and desktops and pads, whose companies sometimes do not agree to support that software forever. They'll put some lifetime on it, and you hope that with fair warning, you'll be able to recover from no more support. But sometimes that means you have to buy a new device, which again is a business model issue. So, so the idea that there is a responsibility to maintain software, I think, needs to be overemphasized in the IoT space. I think at this point, I just want to make 2 or 3 other small points, and then I'd love to go into a Q&A period. I've noticed that in this online environment, that strong authentication is becoming increasingly important. I don't reject the idea that anonymity is valuable and important in the internet environment. You shouldn't have to identify yourself to just do a search. And you certainly should not have to identify yourself just because you went to some website. But there are transactions in which it's very important that no one else can pretend to be you to execute that transaction. For example, withdrawal of money from the bank, or the purchase of stock, or buying a house, or other, financial transaction, or a medical transaction. You don't want people who are not you getting access to your medical records, and worse, changing them so that you have the wrong blood type. And if you have to go into the hospital for a blood transfusion, they have the wrong blood type and you die. So strong authentication is a means of protecting you from someone pretending to be you. That's a vital part of the online environment. And we do not have either national or even international agreements about the strength of that authentication that's going to be needed, especially if we're going to conduct transactions on the net, digitally sign contracts with each other. And then if there's a contract dispute, we have to be sure that in any court that mediates the dispute, that the digital signatures are considered to be enforceable. And that requires standards at the national and international level in order for those signatures to be considered binding. And so here, strong authentication is really important. And of course, we use it for cryptography, and that is to protect privacy and confidentiality. And again, that's a very important part of this online environment. So let me end by pointing out that all of these dependencies impose a great ethical responsibility on those of us who are involved in software production, distribution, and use. And I cannot overemphasize how important it is for us to take that on board, to recognize our ethical responsibilities to people who rely on our software and our software-based systems to operate correctly and successfully, who rely on us to make sure that the software is up to date, that any bugs that have been found have been repaired to prevent harm from occurring because of exploitation of those bugs. I think we need to make sure that we teach that notion of ethical responsibility to software producers in order to impose upon them as strongly as possible the recognition of that responsibility. And finally, I want to point out to all of you who are listening that there is someone who's participating in this show who has exhibited exactly that sense of responsibility, and that's PJN, who is running IIIT and has exhibited extraordinary leadership, bringing this institution, which is so unusual in its structure and focus, to fruition and to success. And so PJN, let me thank you for allowing me to go rattle on for so long. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's been a real privilege and honor to participate in this particular lecture with you. I think you're muted.
Thanks, Vint. Thanks for the kind words on IIIT. I take them, but not on my own shoulders. We have a strong team of faculty and others who do things here. And we have had strong leadership starting with Professor Raj Reddy, Professor Narendra Ahuja, and Rajiv Sangal, who have been before me. So if IIIT has become something, we all owe collective responsibility for that. But thank you for sharing several thoughts that are appropriate and timely in these times, in these pandemic times when we are all wedded to the internet in one way or other. And thank you for creating the internet so that we could function in at least some minimal ways through work from home and remote classes, etc., which wasn't possible in the 1918, the previous big pandemic that we know about, the Spanish flu pandemic. So you have we all owe you a big time in creating this thing so that we are all functioning at least minimally. I would, at the start, I would, since you stuck to this topic, I would like to ask you a few personal questions, which may be of interest to the audience, especially I'm assuming many of our students are watching this. So you got your bachelor's and you were working in IBM. What prompted you to leave that and go for grad school? Why would today's students choose? How would today's students choose between working in a good company and grad school, which is hard work for a few more years and probably better life, etc. So what would be your advice or thoughts be?
So my undergraduate years were at Stanford University in mathematics, but I took every computer course that I could because I was so fascinated by the idea that you could use software to create your own little world and it did what you told it to do. Of course, I very quickly discovered it did what you told it to do, not what you wanted it to do. And often the difference between those is a bug. And I learned how hard it was to find the bugs. So after I finished my undergraduate work, I thought I should find out whether I was really suited to a career in computer science. And so I went to work for IBM in Los Angeles. IBM was at the time among the most respected of the computer companies, certainly a very big and global operation. I was asked to run a time-sharing system. Now, you should recognize or appreciate that this was 1965. And time-sharing had only been invented around 1962 or so at MIT by John McCarthy and his colleagues on a PDP-1 machine from Digital Equipment Corporation. So the notion of time-sharing was very new, and I was privileged as a systems engineer to run that system and had to learn how it worked, especially to fix things that went wrong. So I remember taking home these gigantic thick listings of 132 column paper with assembly language level specifications for how the operating system worked. And so I pored over those documents to try to understand the system and to fix mistakes that I found in it. After 2 years of that job, I realized that I really needed to go back to school. I really needed to understand what the principles were for operating system design. What's a compiler? How does it work? How do I do code optimization? What about data structures? What about queuing theory and networks? So I went back to school, in this case at UCLA, very quickly got involved in the ARPANET project, which came shortly after I arrived at UCLA in 1967. So the point of this response is, first of all, that it doesn't hurt to take a gap period after you get your undergraduate degree to figure out whether you want to be in the business that you've been studying for as an undergraduate. And for me, it was a perfect 2-year break where I had a chance to exercise my skills, but also to learn what really interested me. And that leads me to the second point, which is that if you're trying to figure out how to, steer your career, first of all, I don't think you can. I think steering careers is a myth. I certainly could not have predicted nor have even guessed how my career would unfold. But I will say that you can get clues. Clue number 1, are you good at something? Clue number 2, do you like doing it? And if you can say yes to those 2 things, then you need to answer the third question, can I make a living doing that? Because if you can put those 3 things together, it won't feel like work. It will feel more like fun. And for me, for my entire career, what I have done has turned out to, first of all, I seem to have been able to do it. Second, I've enjoyed doing it. And third, I've had a reasonable career, raised a family, bought a house. So the answer is find something you're good at, find something you like doing, find something you can make a living at, put those 3 together, and your career will just take care of itself.
Thank you. Very good advice. Hope everybody able to find something that satisfies all those 3 criteria. Let me ask you another question. When you first connected 2 computers together, as it's written, the story is told, I don't know if it's true, in 1973, when you created internet, whenever that was, did you have any inkling that it will be as big as it turned out to be?
So, the one simple answer, of course, would be no, but that's not true. It's really not true. So there are several pieces in your question. The first 2 computers that were connected on the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet, were at UCLA. We even remember the date and time. It was 10:30 p.m. on October 29th, 1969. The computer at UCLA and the computer at SRI International in the San Francisco Bay Area got interconnected together by one of the undergraduate students, Charlie Klein, who was part of the project, and that a record of that went into the notebook. And there's a little museum at UCLA that has the equipment and the notebook and other things to celebrate that first connection. When we were working on the ARPANET, the purpose of the system was to connect about a dozen universities together in order to allow the researchers who were sponsored by the ARPA, the Defense Department Research Agency, to study artificial intelligence and computer science. And so they said, look, we're going to hook all of your computers together so you can share your software and you can share your computing capability. So our focus of attention was on resource sharing of diverse and very different brands of computers. And those were hard problems to overcome. And on top of that, we were using packet switching, which was a technology quite different from the traditional telephone circuit switching. So there was some risk associated with all of that. It was wildly successful. And very quickly after the network was up and running and the host computers had been connected, electronic networked mail it emerged as a very popular application. And you could see even then, now we're talking about the early 1970s, this is even before the internet concepts get started, we're seeing the social characteristic of email because people would create distribution lists. And the first two that I got on were sci-fi lovers, because a lot of us were geeks and we all liked science fiction and we argued over who the best authors were. And the other one was called Yum Yum, which is a restaurant review distribution list for restaurants in the Palo Alto area near Stanford. So you could see right away that those were social interactions as opposed to purely scientific or business interactions. So we had some early sense of the way in which these network technologies could influence and support other than purely scientific endeavors. When Bob Kahn and I started working on the internet in 1973, we already had that experience in hand. We had the aspirations of the Defense Department to use computers in command and control. And that meant that for these computers would have to work in ships at sea, in aircraft and mobile vehicles. But the ARPANET's design involved computers that were in air-conditioned rooms in buildings that didn't move around. And so we had to introduce a packet satellite network and a mobile packet radio network into the mix in order to support the command and control concept. Moreover, we needed to be able to do voice, video, and data because we recognize those as components of command and control. And finally, we had to make sure that all the computers involved were fully networked, able to interact with each other, because we were using them, or would be using them, to manage the resources of the military in order to organize it in some particular conflict. And the theory was that if you had computers to enhance your ability to analyze the environment, that you might, with a smaller force, overcome a bigger one because you managed your resources better. And so those are all ingredients that drove the internet design. And I think that because we were focused on those things, that it was possible to imagine that this might turn out to be a very powerful tool in non-military applications. And of course, it took some couple of decades before we got to the point that the internet could be made available commercially. But I think many of us who worked on this could anticipate that it was going to be a big deal and potentially very useful. But the specifics, I think we didn't necessarily know. And of course, Tim Berners-Lee delivers the World Wide Web in late 91. The Mosaic browser shows up in 93. Netscape Communications shows up in 94. They go public in 95, the dot boom is on, and suddenly the internet and the World Wide Web become visible to the general public.
So is it that computers connected to other computers did the magic, or people connected to other people through this computer and network did the magic? What do you think is the truth?
I think they are both magic. They are both magic because the computer interconnection is an enabler. It is something that allows people to interact in such a wide range of ways. I mean, we're using one of them right now, as you can see. But think of all the other ways in which we use computers in order to interact with each other. But I would also point out that we use computers to do things. We use computers to empower ourselves, to enable ourselves to do things that we could not do on our own. And once again, I would cite, for example, searching the World Wide Web is not something you would do by hand. Translating languages is not something you would do by hand if you had to deal with hundreds of them. So these computer systems are powerful enablers for people to do things that they couldn't otherwise do, but they are also enablers of interaction that we could not normally do. I have to give you my favorite example of collaboration. Google has a whole system in its cloud called Google Docs. And they are, typical text documents or presentations or spreadsheets. But the interesting property that this particular product has is that more than one person can be interacting with the document at the same time, making changes at the same time. And if the documents are open for multiple parties, they all see the same document. They can see the changes that are being made in real time. And so there's never any question about what's the most up-to-date version of the document. It's the one that everybody is looking at, the one that everybody is interacting with. And it's pretty obvious that you have to sort out time collisions where two people make changes at the same time. Somehow that has to be resolved as to the order in which the changes are going to get made, and we do that. We also replicate the documents and store them in separate places so that they don't get lost, even if a whole data center goes away. Think about how enabling that is. Think about trying to do that with paper and pencil and 5 people trying to edit a document at the same time. Can't be done. And so, well, I suppose you could, each person could have a separate page and you could work on different pages of a book, but it's not the same as being able to see what everybody else is doing and interacting even on the same page. So these are powerful enabling tools that are, it's more than just connecting computers together, and it's more than just connecting people together.
Pretty amazing indeed. But the early ethos of internet, which continues today, is one of gentlemanly contract. There is no owner or controller for the internet by design. But of late, there are forces that that threaten to splinter the internet, because sovereign nations, when internet has become so powerful and so important in lives of their citizens, the sovereign control over internet is a reasonable demand by according to somebody. So how does this, how long can we maintain, if we can maintain forever, how long can we maintain this free for all nature of internet, if that is what it is?
Well, I think we do need norms, and these are still lacking in the general internet environment. But let's just think a little bit about the internet's architecture and how I think we can evolve an environment on the internet that is more manageable, making the internet safer and more secure and more trustable for everyone. First of all, remember that the design was such that anyone who would build a piece of network and follow the internet design rules, the protocol designs and so on, could reasonably expect that if they could connect anywhere else on the net, that they would interwork. All the devices on their network would interact with the rest of the devices on the internet because they all followed the same protocols. And when we did the design, we basically did not say with whom you could connect and under what terms and conditions. We left that to be an open question. What we were interested in is assuring interoperability by standardizing the protocols. So the business models vary all over the place. And the actual physical implementations vary dramatically as to hardware and software. And the reason that that's important is that there is a substantial degree of choice in the implementation of the internet principles. That means that with regard to the problems that you're alluding to, harmful behaviors, misinformation, disinformation, and the malware and so on, there is freedom to choose different paths for responding to the problem, because the responses to the problem are not necessarily protocol changing, they are usage changing. They are rules for the use of applications. That doesn't change the protocols, it just changes the way in which applications are used. And that's a policy question. And because of the distributed nature of the internet and the way in which it's operated, you have freedom to try different policies in different parts of the net. It's fair to say, of course, that some policies could collide with each other. So you can imagine in one country, certain behaviors are tolerated, and in another country, they are not. And when the parties exhibiting those behaviors suddenly exchange over the network, now you have a policy collision between the two jurisdictions that have different policies regarding that behavior. So let me separate this into two parts. One of them is taking whatever the behavioral policies are and enforcing them within some country border. And the second one is trying to come to commonality across borders about what behaviors are acceptable and which ones are not. We've been able to achieve this agreement on certain kinds of behaviors which we do not tolerate on a global scale. And we also have evolved mechanisms to allow law enforcement to collaborate across international boundaries to deal with extradition treaties and things of that sort. So my sense is that we have a lot of diplomatic tools and tools of international relations that will allow us to establish common agreements, if not absolutely on a global scale, at least among significant groups of countries. And the internet is tolerant of that kind of diversity, and it's also enabling of commonality. So I don't think it's impossible for us to come to some global agreement about certain behaviors being unacceptable anywhere on the face of the earth. And in other cases, it may be bilateral and multilateral agreements that have to be made. The internet is capable of tolerating this kind of variation in the system. So we will find our way towards that commonality over time. We have in other domains.
Another related topic was very big in India a couple of years ago was concerns net neutrality. That has been a characteristic of internet from the start, and there are arguments. Some quarters are making that we can expand the access to internet if you if you are not so strict on net neutrality. This is the carrot is greater access to the internet to some people. So what are your views on net neutrality?
So first of all, I've discovered that net neutrality changes depending on which country you're in. And in the US, the big problem with net neutrality was that we users didn't have very much choice as to who gave them or provided them access to the internet. You didn't have a lot of competition for the users' access to the net. If you were in the rural parts of the US, you often had no choice at all. If it turns out that you didn't have access to the internet at all, or you had very poor quality access. If you were in the suburban parts of the country, you often had a choice of one provider. It might be a cable company or a telephone company, but not both. So you still didn't have any choice. And in the urban parts of the country, sometimes you actually had a choice of a cable company and a telephone company. So you could choose between two. Of course, with Elon Musk's satellite system or other similar systems, maybe you'll have a third choice. But the fact that there wasn't very much choice meant that you could run into a very asymmetric situation. So as an example, if you were a cable company and your business was delivering video to people in bundles of channels, and you decided that one of the things you could now do with the cable is also deliver internet, and you discovered that some of your customers, instead of watching your video service, were using the internet connection to watch someone else's video service, and you decide, that's terrible. Why don't I mess up the internet connection just enough so that they'll be forced to go look at video on my video service? That is essentially an anti-competitive act. And from my point of view, net neutrality always meant to inhibit anti-competitive behavior in an insufficiently competitive environment. That's what neutrality meant. Now, some people misread this as, oh, that means you can't prioritize any traffic. Wrong. As long as everyone has access to the same prioritization at the same price. I don't mean a fixed price, but a price associated with quality of service, for example. It's perfectly okay to charge for different qualities of service, or it might be okay to charge for different maximum bandwidths. If I have a 1 gigabit connection and you have a 2 gigabit connection and the system becomes congested, you're paying more for your 2 gigabit connection, then you should get more access to the internet than I do, at the point where we're starting to compete with each other for access because we're paying different charges. Net neutrality did not mean everybody has to pay the same amount. It did not mean you couldn't do prioritization. It did not mean that you could have different tiers of service. But a lot of people chose to argue that's what it meant because of the words neutrality, and use that to obfuscate what is really needed, which is to make sure that people are not abusing their monopoly for anti-competitive purposes. Now, that's the US picture. In other parts of the world, competition has been introduced in order to reduce the level of need for neutrality, because common resources are made available at a wholesale level, for example, to a collection of retail providers. Google did that in Kampala, Uganda. We built a fiber network for the city, and we made it available on exactly the same terms and conditions to any retailer who wanted to offer internet service and other value-added services. And so there was lots of competition, and the users in the capital had access to different choices depending on what the terms and conditions were. So that was a different way of assuring that there was competition as opposed to anti-competitive behavior. Now, I don't know, the situation in India may be yet another variation on all this. And so speaking of what net neutrality means in India is, for me, harder because I don't know all the details. But I will say that competition is generally a good thing. Choice is generally a good thing.
So switching gears, I've observed you being very enthusiastic about community activities like ACM and other professional organizations. It's not clear if the working professionals in India or even the students in India have sufficient understanding of this. Why are you involved in, say, ACM, MICA, and other voluntary services? What gives you pleasure, and what should a young graduate or a young or not so young professional do in their professional, with their professional community?
Well, I can tell you that as a student at Stanford University, I was asked the question, are you a member of the Association for Computing Machinery? And I'm sorry, I am lying to you. I just realized I didn't even think about that when I was at Stanford. It was until I got into graduate school in 1967. And so here I am, I'm an aspiring PhD in computer science in 1967 at UCLA. And I was asked by one of my professors, are you a member of the Association for Computing Machinery? And I said, no. And they said, well, you should be. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, because it is an indicator of your professional intent. Membership means that you are committed to the principles that ACM stands for, and your customers or your bosses will recognize that they'll recognize that commitment. It is a measure of professionalism. Now, I have to say, over the course of the last, do the math, 63 years, holy moly, that's a big number. That I think that the recognition of the professional value of membership has diminished to some extent. But I think that we are in a position right now to reinforce that notion. And remember, when I was talking earlier about ethics and responsibility, it's my view that as the general public and the business community and governments recognize how incredibly important software is and computer networking is to everything, to the economy, the social structure, all of our daily lives, they will also have to recognize that commitment to professional principles is vital to the well-being of the society. And so organizations like ACM are indicators of that commitment to professional behavior and ethics. And so I think that we can make a very strong argument that joining ACM as a measure of that professional commitment is going to be increasingly recognized as important and valuable because of our heavy dependency on software and all that it does for us.
Thank you, Vint. You mentioned privacy, security, and cryptography as being means to achieve that. There is a lot of talk about blockchains as a solution to many things. What are your views on blockchains being applicable to a wide variety of things?
So, I'm going to tell you a bad joke, which may not work because it has to go so far back into the past. But when I was a young lad in high school, one of the popular, and I had hair like you do, then, trying to getting your hair to work right, there was a product called Brill Cream. And, you rubbed it in your hair. And the advertisements always implied that if you rub Brill cream in your hair, somehow you would be much more attractive to the ladies. And so, Brill cream, a little dab will do you. And some people have treated blockchain like Brill cream was treated 50 or 60 years ago. It's a solution to everything. Now, I am a skeptic with regard to that claim. And not everyone who works in blockchain necessarily makes such an assertion. It just sounds like it because of the hyperbole associated with the blockchain concept, especially the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and others. So blockchain is a distributed ledger. Most of the people who are participating in this call are well aware of that. You could build a similar capability using digital signatures, for example, to assure integrity and to understand origins, sources of material, provenance, in other words, and a more conventional distributed database. So I see blockchain as being useful for some applications at the appropriate scale. So this is one of the big issues with blockchain, and that's figuring out who signs the next block and what is the process by which this is done. If it turns out to require a big competition, which is the case in the Bitcoin, then the rate at which transactions can be signed may be determined solely by the rate at which you can figure out who signs the next block. On the other hand, you might have a permissioned blockchain where all the parties are known, and there's an agreement among the parties as to how the responsibility for signing the next ready block will be undertaken. It could be simply some serial thing where the next person in line does the signing, or if they're not available, there's a timeout, then it's the next person. There could be very simple agreements. And so you could overcome some of the inherent potential let's say, sluggishness of the blockchain execution by making agreements along those lines. So I am persuaded that there are useful purposes, there are useful applications for which blockchain will serve. We use blockchain at Google, for example, for one of our applications called certificate transparency, which relates to the domain name system. So I'm not opposed in any way to this. I am just opposed to the overhyping of blockchain as a solution to everything.
So I have a last question for you. It comes in two parts. First part is what keeps you enthusiastic and energetic day after day? What aspects of technology, I mean, that keeps you energetic and enthusiastic day after day? The part B is what aspects of technology makes you worried and makes you lose your sleep, if anything.
Actually, both of these things cause me to lose sleep, and I've always felt that sleep is a waste of time. I'll sleep when I'm dead. So on the plus side, the thing that keeps me so enthusiastic, of course, especially in this generally software domain, is this endless opportunity. I mean, literally, we are limited only by our imaginations and our ability to program. And for me, that is just so enabling. It is so exciting. And it leads me in various directions like the interplanetary internet, which we didn't talk about. But there's so many opportunities opened up by this particular discipline that, how could you not be enthusiastic about that? The flip side, of course, is that it is such a powerful technology that people can use it to do really harmful things. And sometimes even when they don't know it, like the spread of misinformation, or conspiracy theories and things of that kind. And so what does keep me awake is that this extremely powerful tool might be abused, and it might be abused in ways that are very harmful to individuals, to institutions, and to our society. And figuring out how to warn people and how to train people to either resist temptation or to combat abusive behaviors, to create technology that assists you in that effort, I think it does keep me awake at night. And it's on institutions like yours that we depend, not only to teach the principles, but also to expose the issues, expose the risks and hazards, as well as the huge opportunities, and to address them both so as to maintain the value of this kind of technology for our respective societies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vint, for a delightful yet serious conversation and expressing your views on multiple matters. With that, we come to the distinguished lecture series. This was the fourth and the last one in our Foundation Month series of lectures. I thank everyone, all the four participants who delivered those lectures, as well as everyone who watched it live or later from our YouTube channel. All of them are available on IIIT Hyderabad YouTube channel. I welcome everyone to watch it and understand, get inspired, and get up and going. You know, like Win said, there are endless opportunities, and it's all of us or all of the younger students who are going to make the next big thing. Thank you very much. We will sign off now.
Thank you so much, PJ, and take care and good wishes to everybody.